Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining me on a 5-session study on the book of Ruth. Now, I love the book of Ruth. It's this nice little tiny 4-chapter book in the middle of the Old Testament, in the first half of the Bible. The book of Ruth is the story about struggle, the struggle of these two women, Naomi and Ruth. It's a story about their perseverance through tragedy and how they make their way through it by leaning on each other and leaning on God. Have you ever had something in your life happen where just everything seemed to just totally go wrong? Like your life was great, and then this tragic thing just sort of interrupts all of it. Your life is full and joyous, but then all of a sudden you get that My Chart message saying that something's wrong with your body, or your bank account seems to be positive, but then the mail, all of a sudden an unexpected tax bill shows up, or your kids are doing great, but then one of them calls and they tell you this disastrous mistake that they made. Or your job is doing well, and then all of a sudden you get that company-wide email that says that they're looking to downsize the staff. And all of a sudden your life is different. You're marked by this thing that just happened, that thing that you didn't ask for, that thing that you didn't want, that thing that just seemed to come all the way out of nowhere. You're not who you once were. Now, in the beginning of the book of Ruth, in the first 5 verses, we see just exactly that. I'm going to back up a little, though. It talks about how Ruth happened during the time of the judges. Now, the time of the judges, what this means is that there's this period of time where the Israelites, the people of Judah, God's people, they were ruled and governed by judges before they have a king that comes a little bit later. Now, they're ruled by these judges, and that God sends them these judges and appoints these judges to govern kind of over the people, to handle the law and legal matters, to handle any disputes that might come through neighbors. So it gives us the time frame there when we look at the book of Ruth. And right away, we are introduced to this woman, Naomi, and her husband, Elimelech. And now in the biblical text, every time you see a name, names always have meaning and significance. Now, Naomi's it actually means pleasant. Like, she's good. She's pleasant. Like, her life is good. And her husband, Elimelech, his name means God is king. So they're this pleasant, faithful couple right here in the beginning. Now, the two of them, they live in Bethlehem. They're from the Bethlehem area. This is God's promised land, this land that God promises to be full of milk and honey. Now, the word Bethlehem is actually really interesting, too, because it's actually Bat Lechem, which means house of bread. Even in its name, it talks about how this is a land of food and plenty. But the problem is, for Naomi and Elimelech, is that this land now has a famine. And this land requires them to move so that they can feed their family. Now, this isn't the first famine we hear of in the Old Testament. There are famines all the time that seem to move people out of God's chosen country into another foreign land. Abraham and Sarah moved out almost immediately after they entered the promised land because of a famine. Then later, Jacob and all of his sons, they move into Egypt because of a famine. And now Naomi and Elimelech, they move out because of a famine. They move into this country called Moab, and they're in search of food, and mostly they're also in search of a life. Now, the Moabites, they worship this god called Baal. Baal is a storm god. It's a false idol, this god of rain and fertility. Now, Naomi and Elimelech, they move to Moab with their sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And they're there, and while they're there, their dad dies. Elimelech dies. And her sons, they choose to marry Moabite women, just the women that were there in that country. They marry 2 different Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other one named Ruth. Now, 10 years later, both of Naomi's sons die, and now she's left with just Orpah and Ruth, her Moabite daughters-in-law. And here she was, escaping Bethlehem, trying to escape this tragedy of the famine. But only now in Moab, she's found even just so much more. She's all of a sudden living in this foreign country, and she's got no husband. She's got no sons, which means she has no heir. And she's just there with her daughters-in-law. Later, when she returns to the community of Bethlehem, she starts to tell everybody that her name is no longer Naomi. It's no longer pleasant, but now it's Mara, which actually means bitter. This tragedy, it marks her. It changes the course of her life forever. You see, I think this is so relatable because tragedies, they can do that to us, can't they? They can make us bitter. When hard things come along, we can find ourselves swirling around in frustration and anger and in bitterness. But the truth is that this isn't the end of the story. This is just the first 5 verses. God is still up to something. So join me in session 2 as we get to see what Naomi, with Mara, the bitter Naomi, is about to do. So here's my questions for you to think about as you dive into this first part of the book of Ruth. Number 1, when did something in your life happen that felt like everything was going wrong? And number 2 is, how did you actually deal with that challenge? We'll see you later.